Hello, I'm pleased and privileged to be sitting here with a man who is the longest-term employee of the Walt Disney Studio, John Hench. Thank you for giving us this time today, John.
Well, you're welcome.
We want to talk about the Walt Disney Studio and its work during World War II. And I've read that literally the day after the Pearl Harbor attack, which would have been a Monday, December 8th, 1941, things began to change. The military arrived at Burbank at the Disney Studio, and they never left for the duration.
In Hollywood, Walt Disney has turned over almost the entire facilities of his studio for the production of Army and Navy instructional films, some of them involving closely guarded military inventions and techniques.
Let's go with Navy Project 648, Sequence 1. Let her roll.
Well, it was certainly novel to come to work in the morning and have to pass an armed guard with bayonets drawn. And they kept up a strict military procedure. They changed the guard regularly.
Wow. And
they were quartered there. They spent the night in one of our old buildings, was turned into a kind of a
barracks.
It did make a very curious kind of atmosphere. But then, of course, the whole world had changed for us. There was P-38s flying all over the place, and day and night.
And in the early days of the war, being in California, there was a real fear, almost paranoia, about a possible coastal attack as well, wasn't there?
Yes, because one night we had what passed off as one. At least they were firing shells at San Diego or San Pedro, I guess it was. And we could see them.
Wow.
And the flashlights or the spotlights were sweeping the sky, and it brought it very close to us.
One reason I imagine for that security is that you weren't far from Lockheed, which was a crucial link in the building.
Well, we took several trips to Lockheed and watched what one of our assembly films would do. And of course, we had a salute going in the morning and salutes going out. We felt quite comfortable in the military life.
And it must have been especially incongruous at the Disney Studio, which had such a kind of an informal campus-type atmosphere. It's hard to imagine a military presence there.
Yes, but we felt it, and it was so constant. It did influence us.
What was Walt's involvement in all of this? Now, he pretty much had to put all his plans for the films he was hoping to make during the 1940s on the shelf while this happened, right?
Yes, but he was making notes about things. I think he was really very much interested in the idea of using film as an education, and how much you could teach and how quickly you could communicate with a student or somebody who was learning.
Well, I know that when I was growing up in the 50s, Disney educational films were always my favorite. When they would show those at school, I would pay more attention because they did have a way of being entertaining and teaching you something at the same time. So obviously that skill was refined during World War II.
Yes, and we did everything. We did our own titles, and we were held responsible for quite a lot of things that we had to learn ourselves.
What was your function at that time? You had started in the story department, right?
Yeah.
And then you moved into background painting.
Well, I moved into layout first, because that follows naturally into story development. You're already into the idea of what this space is supposed to be like and what the action that takes place in this space. Of course, it was natural to maybe design that space in layout and follow through and give it color. Because color was a big communicator too, something that people had to recognize in there as part of the story. And so I had worked in story and proceeded naturally into those others, and even into effects animation, because I asked Walt if I could work in camera. And he was very much surprised. He asked why, and I told him about one of my scenes. It was a multi-level multiplane, and I wanted a dark scene. He was passing through under some trees, and I wanted it dark, the pathway dark. And they had measured it with a light meter and decided it was too dark, and so they increased their light to normal angle and spoiled the effect completely. So Walt said, well, okay, you can work in that camera for a while. So he arranged for it, and I did. I worked off and on for maybe a year before this military invasion happened. And so I was quite familiar with camera work, too. So we laid out the camera instructions as well.
So when a film was being planned, the first stage of planning a film would I imagine, be with the story department. At what point would you become involved then?
Well, sometimes with that, after a meeting and getting the idea, and we would make a rough story layout on a board, on a storyboard, and then have the military people come in and make suggestions and correct it or approve it.
Was there an attempt, even in a straight instructional film, to try to give some entertainment value to it or not?
Well, we tried first of all to satisfy their needs in the way of information. We did try to add a little realism in it, and so that things didn't work like maybe like a strictly rigorous pattern.
What's the most unusual or arcane subject you ever had to work on during that period? Do you remember any really odd topics?
Well, they were all kind of odd. We worked on a large bomber that was being produced locally here in Los Angeles. And the number of parts that went into it, were astonishing. Some of the parts were very beautiful, really. It was they bring us over pieces so we could accurately draw them. And the idea was that these would be on lines of assembly, and people would learn what to use and step by step.
And it was felt that a film was the best way to teach them.
It was the quickest way to teach them.
Did the military people that you worked with have any sense of filmmaking, or was that kind of a process where they had to learn what you were about and vice versa?
No, I don't think there were many film-trained people. On large occasions, Walt would join the crowd, and he always livened it up with some theater touches, which would make the thing more agreeable.
And do you think the military people appreciated that or resisted that?
No, I think they welcomed it. He would call for close-ups that they wouldn't have called for, where he was particularly interesting how something fit together.
That's just knowledge of communication, then,
Yes.
isn't it? Using film for communication.
Passing information to somebody quickly and accurately, and pleasantly, too, yeah.
Did you work on any top secret material where there was a security clearance?
There was on most of the things, but especially bombing patterns that were established by floating kind of lights, and the bombing areas were specified by a particular arrangement of color and lights for night bombers. And this, we had the privilege of watching some of them shot off. They would shoot them off on the roof of the studio, and we did start a grass fire once or twice, but they didn't hover in the wind too long. And we had to imitate that with the color as well. And they were shown to the pilots of bombers that were sent to Germany as how to find their targets.
Well, there couldn't be any more important work than that at that time, could there?
No, and it had to be done rapidly because the colors were changed constantly. And so patterns were developed all the time and we had to make these patterns so they could see them, so they would recognize them, because they could study them amidst all kinds of confusing lights the Germans set up.
What do you think of all that when you think back of it now?
I guess it helped the studio out. We were kind of low on work. We hadn't started a picture. And I guess it kind of impressed Walt because he made that picture, Victor, through air power. He went ahead and finished that on the fringe of the work that we have done for the military. And I think he was impressed by these people.
And he was obviously patriotic.
Yankee Doodle, all right.
Do you remember how long you might spend on any given subject?
It would take us several weeks usually because of the clearance we'd have to have and the checkpoint we made and as it advanced, so we would rest our time.
Did you ever design any of those insignias? There was nose art.
I sketched some of them out. The only one I really painted and designed was fairly recently to a parked plane on the Bahamas, where we take our cruise guests. It was an old-fashioned plane. They thought it might be interesting to the guests to see this, that some of them would recognize what it was.
Well, I just saw that last summer, but I didn't know I was looking at your artwork. That's great.
And I know it was a more relaxed thing when we made those emblems for those different departments. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of kidding and a lot of experimental work and so forth, but we had one man who was coloring these sketches and finishing them up, cleaning them up, who happened to be colorblind, and I know he was victimized many times because he read by the label that was on the bottle. And of course, it was a big temptation for someone who changed the labels. And some of them were really improvement.
Do you remember what it was like to make the transition back to peacetime at the Disney studio? This had been such an enormous disruption of business as usual.
In one sense, it was really quite usual. We just had handled different material. Mm-hmm. And it was nice getting back to all color, because sometimes we had a black and white film. Mm-hmm. Quite often we used black and white films for the military work. Mm-hmm. It was the colored patterns in the sky we had to use color film. Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's fair to say that you made some of those films more quickly than you would have if you were not under military?
Yes, we were careful. We planned our steps ahead of time.
That created any long-term efficiency in the production
of animation? Well, probably it did. We had people, when we needed them, to ask questions. Mm-hmm. They arrived. They were waiting for us. And we had checkpoints where we were to have an examination of how far we'd carried, and they were always there. So they kept us really hopping.
Do you remember getting any kind of response or feedback after the fact, or did you just sort of send them out and move on to the next one?
So we got so many requests for emblems for the different teams of people and their different work. I think we took over that field. I don't think anybody else came anywhere near
I never
us.
hear about anybody else having done them except you folks. Are you proud of the work you did during the war?
Oh, yes. Because I believe it was helpful. I believe it was necessary, actually. I believe we were very fortunate to be given that opportunity, and I'm pretty sure we did it better than they'd ever had it before. They made a few of themselves, but I know we made them better and faster than they were doing themselves in their little animation unit in Washington. Mm-hmm. And we must have taught them something too, because we had a few people who managed before the takeover of the studio to enlist, and that's where they were.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.